In 2015, Raj Chetty published a report for the Brookings Institute, which illustrated that the quality of a neighborhood is directly linked to the earning potential of a child. 4 years later, Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, who wrote Third Pillar, said that, well, he argued that while the private sector and governments are scaling up their capabilities, local communities are being left behind in growing despair and unrest. Coming out of COVID-19, there has been growing demand to scale up the resiliency of local communities to more effectively adapt to change. To bring to light the capabilities communities can create, we have brought together 3 community leaders advancing transformation in neighborhoods to not only effectively respond to the challenges of today, but also challenges for decades to come. When a community organizes, some may choose to come together around an issue with an ad hoc, unofficial organization that may eventually cease to exist once the issue they're trying to address has been resolved. Other communities might choose to create an organization that serves the needs of the community for the long term. It's a longer term organization that we're going to be focused on this evening. These organizations come in various forms. In Calgary, they're called community associations. In Toronto, they have BIAs, which are very prominent. In Vancouver, they can be called neighborhood houses. In San Francisco, community benefit districts, or in Victoria, they use neighborhood resource groups. While named differently, they all play a similar role in meeting the needs of the communities they serve. Thank you for joining us for Transforming Communities. We are engaging in conversation with 3 panelists this evening who are leading or once have led local community organizations. I'm so inspired by the group of panelists we've brought together who have been part of leading community transformation. We bring forward highly knowledgeable and experienced panelists. You'll hear many perspectives, some which you may disagree with. While you are welcome to disagree with their perspectives, we ask you to respect the hard work and dedication of our panelists and all the work they put in to help the residents they serve. First up is Jen Balderston. She's the executive director of the Sonalta Community Association, a not-for-profit actively involved in addressing the concerns of the inner city community of Sonalta in Calgary, Alberta. Jen is an experienced community builder and social innovator. She is currently spearheading the SCA's $10 million community hub project, as well as transforming the SCA from an entirely volunteer-run organization to a citywide leader in community building and social entrepreneurship. Jen has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Lethbridge. Next up is Lee Heron. He is the Director of Coaching and Consulting at Scale Collaborative, an organization working alongside nonprofit leaders to create a thriving, connected, and resilient social change ecosystem on Vancouver Island and beyond. Lee is quite familiar with transforming communities, having previously worked as the executive director at Fernwood, a neighborhood resource group society, for more than a decade. He has more than 25 years of experience serving on various boards for community organizations. Lee has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Victoria and a Master's in Environmental Studies from York University. Next up, we have Zara Ismail. She has been the executive director of South Vancouver Neighbourhood House since 2016. She is also the first executive director of the Markhold Neighbourhood House, which opened in 2019. Zara works with her diverse teams to build community connections and strengthen the neighborhoods of Killarney, Victoria, Fraserview, Sunset, and Marpole. Zara has a master's in globalization and international development from the University of Ottawa, a bachelor's in history from UBC, and an associate certificate in fundraising management from BCIT. Zara was recognized as one of Business in Vancouver's top 40 under 40 in 2019. So yeah, I mean, let's dive right into this. Thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us. So what we'll begin with is, the first question is, if, as someone who lives in a community and others, when we've when we find issues that we want to solve or resolve and want to create an organization like the organizations you've either created yourselves or have become part of, where would you suggest someone would start? Like, what are the initial steps to starting to have those conversations around creating an organization, a more sustainable organization in a community? As someone who recently set up a new neighborhood house, I'll start with Zara on this one.
Great, thank you very much, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. My name, as you mentioned, is Zara Ismail. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm calling in from the unceded territory, the occupied lands of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It's been very interesting with Marpole Neighborhood House. I've been the executive director of South Vancouver Neighborhood House for 5.5 years. South Van Neighborhood House has existed since the mid-70s. And it would have started with a very small group of community residents who gathered in probably a church basement, recognized that there was a need for community development in their area, in their ever-changing area. And from that, 40 plus years later, South Vancouver Neighborhood House is a very bustling, thriving space that not only connects neighbors, but also offers programs and services. With Marpole Neighborhood House, which just opened about 2.5 years ago, the experience has been quite upside down, actually, because there was an old fire hall building and the city of Vancouver heard from residents that they didn't want it to be developed. They wanted it to remain, and they wanted it to function once more as a neighborhood house. It had prior been a neighborhood house. There was a flood. It had to shut down. The organization that ran it disbanded. So the revamping and the opening of the new Marpole Neighborhood House was actually something that my organization, the umbrella organization, it's the Association of Neighborhood Houses of BC, we responded to a request for expressions of interest from the city of Vancouver. We were successful. Our task was to go in and create a neighborhood house, but we actually weren't the local residents from there. We did a lot of community consultation, a lot of partnership building, tried to really understand what was going on in Marpole, listen to the people who had advocated for a neighborhood house to remain in their community in the first place, and did everything we could to try to flip that power dynamic back over and put that power back in the hands of the people, where normally organically that's how a neighborhood house would develop. So anyway, I've shared two sort of different examples, and I think there probably isn't a cookie cutter way that something like a neighborhood house could start. There's so many different ways that it can happen. For me, one of the things that I've learned is that having squeaky wheels in your neighborhood, learning how to advocate, getting people mobilized, and finding the voice and agency of local residents, particularly diverse residents, a mix of newcomers and racialized folks and people from equity-seeking groups is really important if you want to establish a neighborhood house that's really going to be inclusive and representative of your neighborhood. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. That's interesting that it was technically initiated by the city. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I used to work at the city of Toronto, and we have they had a program there where they're trying to help lower income communities, for example. But it's the city that went in, and the city that tried to do the work. They didn't try to create this kind of infrastructure that are in the neighborhoods that you serve. So that's really interesting. Thanks for that.
I'll add to that, Ron, just to add something in me. I think physical infrastructure, social infrastructure is critically important. And I know from some of the research we've done in South Vancouver, there's some neighborhoods that, because perhaps there are more squeaky wheels, they tend to get a lot more physical and social infrastructure. Those neighborhoods tend to have a better chance of having something like a neighborhood house in the first place. So I think there is a definite role for cities and other governments who believe in diversity and anti-racism and equity to be taking a bit of that leadership role and making space for communities that might otherwise not be able to get to the place of advocating themselves. So there has to be a bit of a partnership, in my opinion.
Yeah, Yeah, I agree as well. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Jen, did you want to share your story?
Sure. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Sarah. For us here in Sunelta, the Community Association was founded in 1954. So we've been working at building community for quite some time now. And it really came around shared need and the sense of belonging. So Sunelta is an equity seeking community. So 1 in 4 Suneltans live on low income, 27% are new Canadians, many of which came to Canada as refugees. Over 34% live alone, which is 3 times the city of Calgary average, and residents self-report struggling with food insecurity and social isolation. So there's this sense of shared need in the community and the desire to be part of something greater, part of this community. And for the Community Association here in Sunelta, it really started within community engagement. It was about residents getting to know one another, talking about what they really liked about their community, what some of their challenges were, and then coming together to try and make life better for everyone in the neighborhood. And similar to what Zara was speaking about, we do have a partnership with the City of Calgary. So here in Sunelta, we're on City of Calgary land, and our facility is actually owned by the City of Calgary. So we have that physical infrastructure, that magnet or community hub that serves as a place for people to gather. But it does have some challenges. It's about 100 years old, and we call it our Frankenstein. It's actually 4 separate structures that we sandwich together. And I would say the community came together around supporting that treasure, that space that could provide a place for residents to connect. Another thing to consider for us was funding. So how are we going to fund the important work of community development? How are we going to engage the community and get the word out? And then how are we going to evaluate the impact of our programs and services? And those are some of the things that we considered as an organization and still take a look at today and how we're going to build community.
So then your organization started in other ways with the residents organizing and saying, you know what, we can come together and do something here and make an impact. So that's 2 really awesome stories about how you can start with that social infrastructure that Zara had mentioned within your neighborhood to get those wheels rolling. Lee, Jen spoke about having some space within their community that they could use. I think that the Fernwood NRG started somewhat in a similar fashion.
Very much so. We the organization was incorporated in 1979 when I was obviously just a boy. You know, at that time it was incorporated under a different name. It was called the Fernwood Community Centers Management Group. And the purpose of the organization was actually to not take title, but to provide management and stewardship of some community assets, in particular buildings, one of which was an older building and one of which was a newly built community center in the neighborhood. The real sort of test of that organization, though, was maybe 18 years later, I guess, when the city was potentially contemplating repurposing that facility and shifting resources out of the neighborhood. And a group of residents, of which I was one at the time, came together to sort of fight to keep that facility as part of the neighborhood infrastructure and to preserve the right of the community to provide ongoing management of that facility and provide direction for that facility. So, you know, it actually was a little bit of a hot political contest at the time, and we won some friends and made some, you know, I wouldn't call them enemies, but you know, people who certainly respected us after that. But I mean, one option for organizations in underserved communities is to find and repurpose an existing organization. And if that existing organization has assets or has the right to use assets, either through a lease or through an agreement or license of occupation or whatever with the city, that's a terrific advantage for sure. And you might be surprised if you look around. Many of these organizations are looking for board members. And that's how actually I started. I became an ED of the organization 11 years later, but I started on the board. And actually, we did some of our most exciting work while I was on the board.
Thank you for that. Like, there's something around some sort of like, for example, yourselves, you guys had a bit of property. For Jen, they kind of put together some properties, and with Zara's is initiated by the city. And one of the things that we're, we try to highlight here is that here at Imagine City is that not everyone is going to be faced with the same circumstances, and you kind of have to like fiddle around and see where you have those opportunities to advance the organization. So it could be that initiation, or I think Zara called it expression of interest from the city, that you had that opportunity. Or with Jan, it was the organization, some folks coming together, and they had that piece of property. It's not like this like straight path forward to creating an organization like this. So it's a lot of creativity comes into play, it sounds like.
Very much so.
So we're gonna go on to our second question. So this is all around building capacity. And I think Jen spoke a little bit about this with regards to funding and stuff like that. And I think that that's one of, when I hear people talk about community development, they're like, where do we get the money from? So the question I have is, you've all served or have served as executive directors. So from the point where you set up an organization, has a board, people might be just meeting in someone's house, or at a library, as we do sometimes here at Imagine Cities, prior to COVID, by the way. So, like, how do you get from an organization that is that to an organization that can hire an executive director or hire somebody to be able to spend more time in developing the organization and getting resources? We know funding applications take forever. So I just wanted to get some of your insights around funding, around that initial process of building capacity from being able to bring someone in who has more time to do that kind of work. So for this, I thought I would start with Jen, seeing that she had, initiated some conversation around funding.
Absolutely. Well, I'll start by saying that in Sonalta, it was a group of residents that were dedicating hundreds of hours to the building maintenance of our community hall, trying to run events, and then renting the hall in order to build up a reserve fund. And after years and years of this tireless volunteerism, the board sat down and said they wanted to do more than just rent the facility and offer a few events throughout the year. They really wanted to provide meaningful supports and services for the residents in the neighborhood. And they recognized that that was challenging to do on their own while they were trying to maintain this aging facility, fundraise, and do all of the work of running a nonprofit organization. And so it was actually the board or our residents' decision to go out and try and find an executive director. And from there, I would say a key piece of the puzzle is having that reserve fund, because hiring staff is expensive. Making that leap from an entirely volunteer-run organization to having paid staff means that you need to be able to fund that investment. So they had spent many years being really responsible, fiscally responsible, and building up that reserve fund. I would say another thing is community buy-in. So you want residents, and in particular your board of directors, to be ready for that investment and that transition from being volunteer run to having paid staff. And then finding a candidate that's willing to work for a startup organization and all of the challenges and blessings that come along with that. In our particular case, I felt really strongly that coming in as the first executive director, it was really important that I live in the community. And so I moved into the neighborhood and took on the work as a resident. And then another thing I think was a consideration for us is that boards need to recognize that they're going to need to be operational in nature in order to support that executive director or that small team, because it's really difficult for one person to lead alone during those early stages. You're experiencing so much growth and developing the organization. So you have to be willing to start as an operational board, likely transition into a hybrid of operational and governance on your way to becoming a governance board, if that's your plan. And then lastly, I think a strategic plan for how you're going to sustain the staff. So this is where that revenue piece comes in. Once you've hired someone, how are you going to continue to make that investment year after year? And for us, it was really about finding diverse revenue streams, and in particular, investing in social enterprise initiatives. So we had the facility that we could rent when it wasn't being used by the community. And we started to build that up and professionalize it in order to grow our revenue. And I'll speak to that a little bit later, but those are some of the key considerations.
Thanks for that. That was really great and informative. I'm going to ask Lee to answer this question next. And that whole piece around entrepreneurship really comes into play. Jen spoke about it being an executive director. You're in a startup. you're hustling. You're trying to make things happen. Then over time, you build that sustainability. So Lee, do you want to talk a bit about Fernwood and those initial steps that
Sure.
the organization took to eventually become sustainable?
So I just want to quickly echo what Jen said and then put a slightly accounting twist on it. In the financial statements of an organization, there's typically a statement of cash flows, which is at the end, and nobody pays much attention to it because it's really hard to interpret. But the big picture of the statement of cash flows is that there are three sources of cash: operations, cash from financing, and cash from investment. When you're in startup phase, you don't have operations, or your operations are only just nascent. And so it's hard to squeeze enough cash out of those initially in order to invest in staffing at a high level, unless you've sort of come into being with significant operations. Cash from financing, most nonprofits can't get credit unless somebody puts up their own personal house or gives them a guarantee. Sometimes if you're working hand in glove with like the city or whatever, you can get the city to guarantee it or something, but they don't love to do that either. So the big source of investment is from cash from investment. And in nonprofits, we don't issue shares. So we're not looking at private investment from shareholders, we're looking at community investment. So it's donations, it's people making a contribution because they want to see something happen. It's going out and finding those grants from philanthropists and from organizations that want to support our work. That's at startup. But then what Jen said is super important. That investment you can probably count on for a few years, but you can't rely on that, especially now in 2021 and going forward. It's been true for many years, but you can't rely on that, on those types of community investments to sustain the organization indefinitely. And you need to build additional, and Jen used the word diverse, I love that, diverse streams of revenue. And you need to build in some enterprising streams of revenue as much as possible. Now, it's great if you have an asset that you can use to generate some revenue from, but there's all kinds of ways that organizations need to get in touch with their community and find out what the community needs in the way of goods and services and supports, and find out how to, either partner or attract support to make those services and supports available, and then to figure out also like who's going to pay for it, but how it all gets funded and supported. So I think that, Jen talked a little bit about strategy, but strategy, and she I think she's very clear on this because she's obviously done it, but strategy and revenue development need to go hand in hand. Like whatever your organization is going to do to make its impact in the community, you also have to be building in the streams of revenue and resources to support that on an ongoing basis so that the two sort of emerge together. It's really hard to sort of say, here's a great strategic direction, and then, you know, dive into it, and then only after the fact worry about how are we going to resource that. I think that's a recipe for failure. And so I'll talk a little bit more about Fernwood as we get into the rest of the conversation. But yes, we really worked hard to develop enterprising streams of revenue from about midway through our journey. I said we were incorporated in 1979, but from the early 2000s on, we put a real emphasis on diverse and enterprising streams of revenue.
I feel like it's one of these things that keeps on coming up. It's as if you know, you're running a business. It's not a business. I get that, but it's like you have to be that level of creative, and I would say even more so because you don't have access to loans and lines of credit and all these other mechanisms that a business does. So I would say that running an organization like what you all are running is kind of like you're creating something literally out of nothing, because of its people power. Really, it comes down to it. Sounds like. Zara, did you want to maybe chime in and speak some more about you know, how you get from the point of setting up the organization to getting to the point where you're getting that revenue and being sustainable?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in brief, I'd say with great difficulty. Your question made me think about Marple Neighborhood House a lot, because we've been around just for 2.5 years, and 1.5 years of that has been during COVID. So it's been very challenging, but some of, in general, I think some of what a lot of organizations like ours need to do in order to support the community development aspects of our work. One of my observations is people don't really want to fund community development. It's not tangible. It's vague. So we do that through having a lot of direct programs and services, whether that be programs like childcare or seniors wellness. We run a couple of adult day programs, so we have good contracts with Vancouver Coastal Health. We have, the word again, diverse revenue streams through a lot of programs and services. And then it is a little bit of figuring out how each of those programs and services contribute to community development, making sure that those themes run through all the programs, but then also how to extract a little bit of administrative dollars so that they can be used creatively to do the work that nobody wants to fund. I wish they did. And if I can advocate at all for people to just fund community development, that would be one of the takeaways I'd want to leave people listening with. But in terms of Marpole, I can share that when we were opening up, we've leaned a lot on volunteers in the neighborhood because we haven't been able to afford a huge team. What we did, because we are part of the Association of Neighborhood Houses of BC, the executive director of South Vancouver Neighborhood House was able to go and do the startup work along with a contractor actually that we hired through an investment from Alexandra Foundation, which is a foundation that exists to support the startup of neighborhood houses across BC, and also capital support and things like that, but very focused on neighborhood houses. So we looked at for who our allies were. We leveraged that big sister relationship, internally with HBC. We also focused a lot on partnerships and going into a new neighborhood and setting up a new neighborhood house. We recognized we wouldn't be able to deliver all the programs and services that the community would benefit from directly. We also didn't want time. So we entered into more of a hub model where we have lots of different organizations working out of our location. And together we're piloting shared leadership and figuring out how we can share decision-making in that space and create a more wraparound space for the community. So regardless of which service provider is offering a service or a program, it can be part of Marple Neighborhood House, and the community really, to most people, it wouldn't matter if it's coming from one organization or another, as long as they're getting good information and they're being referred really, really well. A few other points is to be reasonable with expectations and not expect to be massive overnight. Gradual increase so that it can be sustainable growth. Municipal support is really critical. In Marpole, we are in a city building. I think if we were paying, even below market rent for a leased property, it would have been impossible for us. And hustle. Look for partners, look for grants, get the word out there. Promotions are really important.
Awesome, thank you for that. And that's a piece of innovative thinking in the sense of shared leadership and shared resources. It reminds me about programs I've read with regards to housing, transitional housing, where they bring in all these services to support the full person rather than, here's a house, deal with it. So yeah, that's really awesome. That's something I picked up when we discussed last, and it continues to resonate with me. So thank you for that. So we're going to head on to our next question, which relates to that building capacity piece. So you've got these residents, you've come together, you've created this organization, you've launched some initial programs, and now you have an executive director or some part-time staff that can help. So as an organization, how did you identify, because we talk about, diverse revenue streams and stuff like that. So you need to be able to create stuff that people are going to want. So how did your organization kind of figure out and play around with that to learn about the community and what they need and how and what those initial programs and services would look like? So this one we'll start with Lee. And really how it pertains to Fernwood NRG. What was that journey look like if you
So when I started with the organization on the board, I mean, we did have childcare operations. We did have some recreation programs that were providing service to youth and seniors in the community. We did have a family support program that was funded through contract and so on, and providing counseling, and we had drop-in programs, Canada Prenatal Health and Nutrition. So there was already quite a well-established program base. In my time on the board and then as executive director, we significantly increased our childcare programs, and that was really in response to community need. So, people were coming, asking for childcare. The 90s became the 2000s, and it was evident that, more and more families were having children and also then wanting to go back into the workforce and needing childcare for younger age children and so on, not just once their children were in school. And so we really responded to that, and from 1998 through 2019, we quadrupled the size of our childcare program. We also added affordable housing. Victoria, like many markets across Canada, went through a real crush of, the vacancy rate was very, very low, and prices started to climb. And so our organization wanted to, add affordable housing as an activity, and we were able to successfully do that through a couple of properties that we acquired and one that we developed. That was a big challenge for our organization to sort of grow into that. But, it's a small difference. I think at our peak, we had 15 units, and I think we had maybe 14 now. But, we're doing what we can with the resources that we have available, and we obviously support other organizations and advocate for affordable housing. But all of those things, it really is listening and observing where the challenges lie. Jen, gave a bit of an overview of the demographics and some of the statistics about the community. I think you need to know what the issues are in your community. You need to know those numbers, and then think about how to translate what that need might look like into service. You can also do it by getting out of the front door and talking to people on the sidewalk and hearing what their concerns are, and the picture will emerge.
Talking to people on the street, Lee, does that still happen?
Yeah, it's kind of out of fashion, but I think it could be coming back.
So thank you for that, Leah. I think when I read about Fernwood and the affordable housing in particular, is just being able to get pockets of funds from all these different sources, foundations, the federal government, the provincial government, the local community, and it was quite a diverse, if I remember correctly, quite a diverse funding for that affordable housing. So yeah, and it speaks again to that ability to just maneuver and find the gaps and fill those gaps and all that sort of stuff. And so thank you very much for that.
Yeah, sure.
Zara, did you want to maybe talk a bit about how you do this work, finding these problems?
I really appreciated what Lee said, just about asking people for feedback and listening to that feedback. I think that's really important. A lot of service providers, I think we can get into expert mode, and it's really probably not the best, because people who live in a community know what they need. And we need to remind ourselves of that all the time. When we opened up Marple Neighborhood House, before we opened, we did a lot of community consultation, and we did research. We looked at the statistics and tried to get a good picture of what was going on. We talked to, like I said, the partners who had been working there for a long time, community leaders, residents, etc. But when we actually opened up, people would come in the door and they said, "Oh, where's your program schedule? I want to know what activities I can participate in." And so we use that as an opportunity to say, well, what kind of activities would you be interested in? And what kind of activities would you want to lead? Because so much of what we do at neighborhood houses is not about us as experts imparting knowledge or experiences for people. It's about figuring out what assets exist in a neighborhood and how people can do peer-to-peer learning and development and exchange to develop those relationships and that capacity, really. And so it was a matter of flipping that power dynamic around again and seeing how we could engage people in the development of their own community. So it was really interesting. That was a very good way of collecting information. I think for some people, it felt a little flat at first. They're like, oh, there's actually nothing here. But we didn't want people to think that we were the experts and we had already decided what was good for them. We wanted to take that time to do community consultation and engagement and make space for people's voices to come to the forefront. Our youth programs, the youth are the first ones who took that on. And it's actually really beautiful. About 2.5 years in, the amount of ownership that they have over Marple Neighborhood House is phenomenal. They feel that it's their space. And we have 3 youth representatives on our board, and they are as active, if not more active, than everybody else on the board. They're phenomenal. So it's a good success. And that's how we know we're making a good impact.
Yeah, that's such a great story, because it really speaks to, Lee was talking about before, getting on the street and talking to people. And I just find that, or I think that doing that today in this social media heavy world, it would seem kind of odd. It could seem kind of odd, that kind of experience with folks. And it's, being able to create those environments where people can become more comfortable with just freely interacting with people they don't really know. Just like, the volunteers in your organization, they're always connecting with folks they don't know, and rebuilds that social trust, that social connection. And I remember reading a piece of research, and I'll make this quick, is that they're talking about crime in neighborhoods. And the number one thing to reduce crime in a neighborhood is to have connections, to know, like, hey, that person's going through something, let's try to help them out, or, that sort of stuff. It really, it drives that, it really drives that impact. Just next up, I just want to ask Jen her thoughts around the programs that her community association has has launched and even maybe not launched because they had an idea and it was like, community doesn't need it, so let's not do that.
Yeah, perfect. I will speak to us launching a program and learning that it wasn't actually serving needs. But first, in stark contrast to Lee, we didn't have any programs and offerings outside of a Stampede breakfast every year when I first joined the organization. And the first thing we did, to echo Zara, is we did a year-long engagement. We reached out to residents. We asked them, what do you like about your neighborhood? What concerns you? What kinds of programs and services would you benefit from? And then what types of spaces or amenities would you like for the community? And then we took all of that together into an engagement report. And we always refer back to that when we're looking at what kinds of programs or services do we want to implement in the community? Well, what has the community told us that they want or need? And then we do that informally on a daily basis when we're talking to residents on the street. When we're engaging in programs and services, we're always trying to seek input and feedback from the people that live and work here. And from there, we were able to build up to over 400 programs and initiatives throughout the year. And how we did that was through collaboration, which both Lee and Zara spoke to, collaborating with other nonprofits, other key stakeholders, local businesses. And then that resident leadership or ownership piece that everyone has spoken to, in that we get community members to be their own problem solvers and to take pride in running their own programs and events and building up their capacity to drive change in their neighborhood. So to talk to Zara's comment about getting into expert mode, I'll give you an example of a program that we launched and how much we learned from the experience. So from our engagement, we knew that food security was a challenge in our neighborhood. So we collaborated, we partnered up with local charities to bring a mobile community market and a good food box program to the neighborhood, which dramatically increased food access and affordability. And we thought we were having this huge impact and didn't realize that we still had a lot to learn from folks in the neighborhood with lived experience. So we continued to engage daily, and we heard from many Sinaltans who were newcomers that it wasn't about folks that are hungry that need access to food. It was about food security on a spectrum. So everything from no access to food to no access to healthy foods to an important piece was no access to cultural foods. And so the foods that we were offering weren't what some people were looking for. And so we heard from our new Canadian population that, you know, their kids were going hungry, for example, because they didn't recognize or like any of the food that was available for them. And that the closest place to purchase those foods was a long drive, was inaccessible by transit, and they perhaps didn't have access to a car. And so now we're working on getting cultural foods incorporated into those programs, so into the mobile market, into the good food box to better serve that need. So it's important that we don't ever get into expert mode, and that we always consider that there might be segments of the population, say, that aren't being best served by some of the programs. So I think sometimes by not meeting a need, we learn how to better meet it in the future.
Awesome. Thank you for that story. That was incredible. I find that folks don't like to admit to mistakes sometimes, and it's admitting to that mistake that helps you find that opportunity as well, which you clearly demonstrated there. Next up, we have another question here around challenges. So looking back on your work, can you describe a challenge you faced as a leader that if you didn't overcome would potentially lead to the demise of your organization? And how did you overcome it? So Zara, can we start with you, please?
Ooh, the demise of my organization. That's very dramatic. I don't know
It
if I
is.
can think of anything
We need
like that.
we needed to up the drama in this.
I can give an example of how we really leveraged our potential.
Better way of looking at
yeah,
it.
I can't really think of how we've gone through some hard times, but nothing quite, especially for SB&H. It's been around for 40 plus years. It's quite stable. We were evicted from one of our spaces where we ran an adult day center. It was going to redevelop. That was really challenging, but it's not a very interesting story. We ended up finding a new space. So I'll go with what I was going to say initially. South Vancouver, it's a very, very underserved area. it makes up a sixth of the city of Vancouver's population, but it used to be a separate city quite a long time ago. So when it was merged in, it's never really been treated as a part of the city in the same way. What am I trying to say? It feels like an afterthought neighborhood. Let me put it that way. And it is a big population, a sixth of the city, right? 102,000 people. The thing that we realized with our latest strategic plan is that our community is made up of 80% racialized people and 55% newcomers, which is the highest density of both of those groups in Vancouver. But the assets and amenities were disproportionate and underinvested in our neighborhood. So we started asking a lot of questions about equity and representation. And what we've done is started to push back against South Vancouver being categorized as one neighborhood. If you look at a City of Vancouver map, it's actually 3 separate neighborhoods that make up South Vancouver. There's Sunset, Victoria, Fraserview, and Killarney. And they're vibrant, they're dynamic, they deserve to have their names said. They should have different strategies for placemaking and development and engagement. Taking people who live a 20 or 25-minute drive away from each other, in Vancouver, that's a lot, and categorizing them as part of one neighborhood with very little to define it is really, it's not doing a service to anyone. So that's one of the challenges that we were working with. We were very culpable in that, being the South Vancouver Neighborhood House. When we did asset mapping, we did it for South Vancouver. So over the last little while, and with our new strategic plan, we're actually pushing back on ourselves and trying to figure out how we can better respect and reflect the diversity across our neighborhoods by understanding what we're calling the micro neighborhoods across the region are, and looking for ways to engage with community leaders and residents in those micro neighborhoods to develop strategies that are specific and unique to those neighborhoods. In our view, if we're successful with this reframing of South Vancouver, it's going to lead to enhanced equity, better belonging, and social engagement and connection over the decades ahead. So it's been a real shift for us. And, you know, in my opinion, if we hadn't made that change, South Van Neighborhood House would have still been fine, but with the change that we've made, the potential for impact for the people who live across South Vancouver, their visibility, their agency, it's probably, you know, 10 or 20-fold. So it's exciting. And I'm hoping, you know, it'll be very interesting to see how it unfolds because it's new for us.
Yeah, and it's all like, you know, you make the biggest impact in those finer details, right? So when you apply this wide definition, it's kind of like well, you know, it's more difficult to make progress because the folks who live there may not identify with those lived experiences and stuff like that. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And Jen, did you want to speak next with regards to a challenge you may have faced and overcome or not overcome?
You bet. So essentially being a nonprofit startup back in 2016, when I joined the organization, I'm going to embrace that drama and say that we definitely faced some challenges that could have led to really serious impacts for our organization. So the board had invested a significant portion of its reserve fund into my salary for the first year. And so I was tasked with not only fundraising my own wage, but trying to ensure long-term sustainable funding. So for us, it really did feel critical. And so for us, it was the challenge of securing unrestricted operating funds. So funds that you could use for any operating costs that you had, that say a donor didn't say you could only use for this program or this event or so on. And in Alberta, because I know our other panelists are from BC, there's only one grant that funds operating costs for community associations. And naturally, it's oversubscribed. And so we had to look at ways to diversify that revenue stream. And so our team, we've grown since then. So our team of volunteers, board members, and now staff have worked really hard in order to create reliable and diverse revenue streams, with that long-term plan always of becoming financially self-sustaining so that we could earn our own revenue and that any grants or donations were a bonus, but that they weren't required to keep the lights on and run our programs and services. So in addition to fundraising, we focused most of our attention on further developing those social enterprises. So as I mentioned earlier, our facility rentals, but we also created partnerships for passive third-party fundraising, which for our team was incredibly important because we're such a small team. We didn't have the resources to do anything that required active work. So for example, we have a partnership where a clothing recycler hosts a clothing bin on our space, and then we get a percentage of the revenue from the clothes that are being recycled. So that's one way that we're able to earn income without having to invest time and energy into that fundraiser. And then also taking on other social enterprising activities. So we partnered up with a local coffee company, and we sell Sonalta branded coffee in order to raise revenue. Another thing that we did just really quick was, as a COVID pandemic response, we partnered up with a local community economic development organization and created an online store for local social purpose businesses to be able to sell their goods online. So that way 100 small businesses didn't each have to invest the time and money into creating an online sales platform, but we did it for them. And then we charged a really small percent of their sales in order to cover our costs. So those are some of the ways that we looked at diversifying those revenue streams. And then the other thing that I would say is that we were very lucky in that we had funding partnerships that were able to fill the gap in order to give us the time and space we needed to get to that sustainability endpoint. So that they said, we'll fund you for the first 2 years of your operating costs while you start to build up your own sustainability.
Wow, incredible. That's again, it comes back to that ingenuity, that innovation, that creativity, that just breaking down some walls. As hard as it is to break down walls, you kind of have to create new opportunities for yourselves. So that was a great story. Thank you so much for that. Lee, let's talk about Fernwood now.
So when Zara talks about South Vancouver as a neighborhood being 100,000 people, I mean, 100,000 people roughly is bigger than the entire city of Victoria, not the region, but the city of Victoria. So, from the point of view of a Vancouver city planner, Victoria is one neighborhood. But in fact, we do have, I think, 10 or 13 micro neighborhoods, of which Fernwood is one. And one of the things that the city sort of got itself into was putting centers in each of these neighborhoods. And so this was a very decentralized growth and investment into neighborhoods that started in the 70s. Ours was built in 1980, but continued through the mid 90s. But eventually the city started to realize that the cost of maintaining and supporting all these facilities was actually prohibitive. And they were then sort of stuck not being able to have the big new pool and the big new rec center that the outlying suburban communities were building. Like the Commonwealth Pool was built for the Commonwealth Games in Victoria in 1994 and really started to pull recreation interest out of the pool in downtown Victoria and into the suburbs, right? So anyways, you've got there's all this complexity going on, but the city was trying to figure out how to get out of these neighborhood centers and build and pool all their resources and build a single big center. And anyways, our center was on the chopping block in 2005. We were due to be closed, and I was on the board at the time, and RED just actually got way out in front of the board, which I can't always advise, but from time to time, it's a good idea. And she just got on the radio, got on the television, made this a public issue. The mayor and a councillor were forced to come to a public meeting at the community center, and they heard from all the people who would actually be directly affected if the city closed the center. They went back downtown, put that report on the shelf, and it was never heard from again. And so it was a real strong story of political organizing. It's 2021, and we still don't have a new rec center in the city of Victoria. The last neighborhood center was built in the early 2000s, and there hasn't been a new one built since. I think there's some talk about new investment now. So it wasn't a, I mean, it was an existential crisis for our organization, and we really did have a sort of an outsized impact in how the city developed its recreation programming. And I think that this decentralized program we have in Victoria is a source of strength, but further to some of Zara's points earlier and so on, there are other neighborhoods that didn't get a center, and that the city's sort of program of building out centers wasn't actually in the end fully equitable. But we're very grateful in Fernwood that we were able to keep our center.
Yeah, the lack of investment kind of reminds me about Jen's story earlier about the Frankenstein building, just piecing things together to make it work, because again, you can't rely on that kind of level of external funding. Thank you so much for that story, Lee. That was fantastic. We're a few minutes behind, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit here. So our next question is around diversity and inclusion. Has the topic of diversity and inclusion been brought up within your organization? But with relation to Lee, has it been brought up in any of the organizations that you have served, or with Fernwood? And can you, if so, can you give me a story around how that conversation has shaped your work? So Jen, let's start with you.
I'll try and keep it quick, not get too long-winded. Feel free to cut me off if you need to, but it's definitely come up. Sunalta is a beautifully diverse community, and we work really hard to celebrate diversity and to create inclusive and welcoming spaces, but we're always learning, and sometimes we don't always get it right. But I'll give you one quick example of how it shaped our work. We have a number of Indigenous groups that use the space regularly, and they had come to us and said, we haven't been allowed in the past to smudge in the facilities that we've been using. Is that something that we can do here? And our answer was, of course. We actively encourage our groups to smudge, and we took it a few steps further in posting smudging notices at all of our entrances, trying to educate everyone that entered on the cultural practice. And in designing our capital campaign, so we are currently fundraising for a new building. Ron had alluded to that earlier. In our engagement, we learned that an exhaust system would be really helpful. And so we've built it in so that we can enable smudging in all of our spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that story. That is, the whole idea of listening keeps on coming up, and it's a theme in this conversation, listening to, your residents and all the communities that exist within your community, whether whoever they may be. Zara, did you have a story for us with regards to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, we've been working on diversity and inclusion issues at South End Neighborhood House for quite a long time. We have a statement of diversity. We do our best to maintain a very open, inclusive environment. We've also, over the last kind of year and a half, 2 years, for obvious reasons, been shifting a lot to focusing on anti-racism as well, beyond diversity and inclusion, which is critically important. I think it's really important that diversity be reflected at all levels of leadership. And so that's something that at South End Neighborhood House and Marple Neighborhood House, it's really meaningful, I know, to our team. Our team reflects our community, and our management team and our board also reflect our community. So really being able to make space for people who understand the community well, with some lived experience, languages that they can speak that relate to the people who are benefiting or being impacted anyway from our services is really important. So I actually had an anti-racism committee meeting today, and we were trying to figure out how would we know if we became an anti-racist organization. And I kind of laughed and I said, well, I don't know if I've ever interacted with an anti-racist organization before. I don't know if they exist. I don't know what that is. So anyway, we're gonna do some dreaming with our team and set our North Star so that we know what we're working toward. But in terms of engaging with residents, we do our best to make sure that there's inclusion for the LGBTQ community, and people with varied abilities and racialized folks and people of all different backgrounds and geographies, languages, et cetera, et cetera. It's a work in progress always, but we do our best for sure.
Thank you for that. I keep on thinking when it comes, to the level of creativity and that you need to run a successful organization. Just from I think even from a competitive advantage, it's kind of like the more diverse, the more the better the ideas that come up. So, and that's been shown in a number of different studies. Lee, did you want to talk about Fernwood?
Sure. So I think that, in terms of where it is in the city of Victoria, Fernwood is as diverse a neighborhood as any in the city of Victoria. Certainly the city of Victoria is nowhere near as diverse as Zara's community in South Vancouver, for instance. Having said that, the surest way to ensure, from my point of view, that you are as inclusive as possible to the folks in the community that you serve is to ensure that your staff team actually represents the community. And that means really checking all the way through to ensure that you are welcoming and inclusive and inviting people in and not being biased in hiring to the extent that you can identify where you might be being biased and eliminate those biases. I felt we did a pretty good job of that in Fernwood. I think we really struggled to diversify our board. It was a point of frustration for me, but yeah, it's an ongoing struggle for all of us to be as diverse and welcoming and inclusive as possible. And I think that's something that we're all trying to learn more about. I did feel good when a colleague of mine who works at, who's the leader of the Indigenous Perspective Society, we had invited her organization to come in and provide some cultural sensitivity training and sort of history of colonialism training for our childcare and staff team at the society. And she came up to me afterward and she said, "Lee, it's actually very impressive. Your organization, relative to many of the ones we work with, is incredibly diverse." And I said, "Well, we have to be, because the people we serve, in order to have the people come in from the neighborhood, we need to reflect the neighborhood." And so we've gone out of our way to do that. But yeah, it's an ongoing struggle for all organizations, I think.
And that's a great point you make, Lee. It's like, who's going to use your services is going to be directly correlated, I think, with the board and your staff, because they're going to go out and tell their community about it. And if their community doesn't include all communities, then there's going to be some communities that are left out and not participating. And even coming to a community hub or community center, being able to see and interact with those who look like you and can understand your lived experience, and then connecting with them, and then them connecting, and all of you connecting together. It's that safety, and then that safety allows you to kind of push out and connect with other folks. So thank you so much for that. Our next question relates to mental health. So we know that this is a topic that continues to come up with regards to a variety of different issues. But in this issue, conversation, we're going to specifically deal with leaders of organizations like yours. So there are tremendous ups and downs when setting up and operating a local community organization. Have any of you struggle with mental health issues in your own work? And what do you do to overcome them? And just so everyone knows, we did have a conversation prior to this around this question in particular, because we don't want to put this onto folks to share if they don't feel comfortable, but everyone seemed comfortable to share. So that's why we included the question. So I was hoping that maybe we could start with Lee and maybe talking about Fernwood, and your
Yeah.
with regards to mental health. Go ahead.
So I just want to say that if you're called to be a leader of a community organization, even just listening to the stories today, the the challenge of the dread of maybe not having enough money from month to month to get all the work done or to pay all the people, to potentially losing a facility or losing a program, to the elation of being able to announce a new agreement or a new partnership or a new location. There's a lot of ups and downs. It really is an emotional roller coaster. And in my time as a board member, I certainly experienced that when we had attempted to bring two organizations in the neighborhood together to overcome what we felt was a pretty existential crisis in the neighborhood. And it seemed to be going well right up until it didn't. And then it became incredibly divisive and bitter and acrimonious. And there was a lot of, negativity and negative emotion. And it was hard not to get caught up in that. But when I became ED, based on that experience and how difficult that was and sort of the ups and downs, I resolved to try to lead from a place of equanimity and taking it as it comes and not allowing my emotions to get ahead of me or to drive me in decision making. And I don't know whether people appreciated that or not, but as a result of which, I don't feel like I did have tremendous struggles, but I became sort of very, level about things and only permitted myself to actually celebrate success after it was in the bag, not to ride the roller coaster. So that's my advice too.
Yeah, roller coasters are very difficult to ride, that's for sure. And being able to have that wherewithal and that awareness around this is going to have its ups and downs. I'm going into it knowing that I might still go with the ups and downs, but I mean, like you said, it kind of helps, right? It kind of helps being aware of that going into it, and preparing yourself, trying as best as possible to prepare yourself for it. Zara, did you want to share anything with regards to mental health when it comes to being a leader of organizations like a neighborhood house?
Sure, yeah. I think management, leadership, they're hard. There's a lot of people relying on you all the time. So there can be a lot of pressure and a lot of weight on your shoulders, and it can be hard to bear sometimes. So I think having people who you can confide in. I'm always encouraging my team to use the family assistance program that we have and access counseling when it's needed. I do that myself. I think it's really important that people share that, we all need help sometimes, and it's good to have somebody to talk to, and just to have a neutral party to be a sounding board. So yeah, I'm a big fan of counseling. I mean, for me lately, I feel like I've been doing a better job of having balance, but making time for self-care, going for walks and doing yoga. And I'm in a hip hop class on Mondays, which is changing my life. It makes me so happy. But it's really important to make sure that there is time for those things, because I think without that, it can feel like a lot of energy is being extracted and not a lot is coming back to fill your bucket back up. So good tips, I think, for any human being. It's life is all about balance, right? And we've got to do our best to look after ourselves.
Yeah.
I was gonna, when we talked before, I had gone through a hard time when my father passed away. So at that time, I was really grateful to have a really supportive workplace where I could take the time that I needed to grieve and, to be there with him. And that was really meaningful and important. And I think, again, because I was able to do that as the leader, it gave permission to my team when they needed that time that they could take it, and so modeling the behavior we want to see in others is really key.
Yeah, that's a great point to make. We all have our upper limits or upper limits to what we can do and what we have capacity for. And it's like, I feel like it's over making the mistake a few times that I've also learned that, okay, I can't do this. I used to say yes to everything, right? Especially in purpose-driven work. It's like, I need to help, I need to do more, but then you get run down, and you get and it impacts the work, obviously. So thank you for sharing that story, and modeling is so important. I agree as well. Jen, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, well, I will echo everything that Lee and Zara said, and maybe take a different angle on it and talk about some of the strategies that we implemented as an organization to support our leaders and resident leaders as well. As we heard today, communities are complex, and the challenges facing them require a great deal from our community developers. And so our team definitely struggles with mental health. And some of the things that we've done as an organization is to try and support that work-life balance with paid vacation that exceeds industry standard, personal days and mental health days for folks to take as they need, no questions asked, work coverage for time off so that our team doesn't return to work with an overwhelming workload. Zara spoke to this, but fostering a good work culture where we build supportive relationships with our team and our volunteers so that folks have someone to open up to or to lean on when things get tough. A key one for us was also work share. So we tackle the difficult stuff together. So when we have to do something that's going to impact our mental health or potentially impact our mental health, we never do it alone, right? We do it alongside the people we trust. And then another key one for us was reaching out to other organizations when we faced a problem that felt too big for us to tackle alone. And this collaboration really allowed us to have that shared responsibility. So it felt less onerous, like the whole weight of the world was on our shoulders. But then also we can benefit from each organization's skills and assets so that maybe what we lack in resources, our partner organization has, and vice versa. And those are some of the things that we found have really supported our team and our community leaders.
Wow, that sounds amazing. It's I feel like sometimes, especially when you're doing this purpose-driven work, it's one of these things that it's this expectation. It's the thought that because we're doing purpose-driven work that it feeds us already, so we double up and so we'll be fine. But that isn't the case, as shown by all three of our guests this evening. Even in purpose-driven work, you have to give yourself time. So the last question we have this evening is around advice for others. So if you've come across someone who is eager to set up a local community organization and you have time to give him or her one piece of advice that would help them on their journey, what piece of advice would that be? And let's begin with Zara.
I would say to go for it and be ready to learn from your mistakes, have a growth mindset as much as you can, and don't go at it alone. Figure out who your allies will be and find them. They're out there, and have fun.
Thank you for that. Jen?
Well, we've touched on it quite a bit in different ways today, but I would say to be careful not to try and fix things for people, that you'll find lasting success when you fix things with people. And it's a really simple but really powerful distinction.
Yeah.
That's everything Zara said.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I always think about some folks are like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I think from this talk we've heard sometimes you all didn't know what you're doing, but you dove into it and you tried to make it happen. And sometimes ignorance is bliss because you don't know what you're up against until it's all over and hopefully you've succeeded at the end. And Lee, any comments from you?
Sure. If you're starting out organizing and you want to figure out how to get community out, organize around food, organize around art, organize around gardens, these are ways to very immediately and viscerally connect with people. Having said that, yeah, just do it. The goddess Nike is a patron saint of community organizers. You know, one of the things that we did in Fernwood that I think served us very well was we articulated our principles and values. They're on the Fernwood NRG website. I'll put a link in the chat, and maybe you want to share that later, Ron. But
Sure.
be clear on who you are, your own identity, and then it's harder for you to be pushed off that and what you stand for. And then the hard times that come up in organizing, you will be able to know where you stand, and you won't have to. You'll feel a lot less unmoored and adrift in your day-to-day work, because things will come up that challenge you every day. And so having a really clear sense of who you are, I think, is really important.
Did you say the goddess Nike?
Yeah, it's just a wisecrack.
I was just about to write Nike for sponsorship, but so I just want to, conclude by just thanking all of our panelists and all of our guests for joining us today. It was quite an exploration of a very important topic that's being widely discussed at the moment, right? Especially coming out of COVID. I'd also like to thank our volunteers at Imagine Cities. Across our organization, we have around 50 volunteers spread across 12 teams. We even have volunteers from as far as Mumbai, India. Social media, you can follow us on most social media platforms. You can check us out at imagincities.com. If you know people, companies, organizations who are interested in developing strong local communities, we encourage them to learn about us and join our community here as we try to do the same. And stay tuned as we pilot more programs and products to support building more stronger and resilient local communities. And we appreciate all feedback that you can provide. That's the quickest I think I've done at closing, just to keep us on time here. I'd like to, again, thank everyone for joining us this evening. And if you have any questions, concerns, comments, feel free to write us. And thanks again to our panelists. Have a great evening. Bye. Oh.